Good afternoon again. Thank you all so much for joining today's call. So that everyone knows, the call is being recorded and that recording will be shared later on today. We're going to take questions that are submitted in the Q&A box following the data summary of the report. And as always, if there are any questions or interview requests after the call, please email me directly at jbutler@nlihc.org. We're going to be joined today on the call by Congressman Jimmy Gomez, representing California's 34th Congressional District. Congressman Gomez is the founder and chair of the Congressional Renters Caucus. He is one of three co-authors of this year's Out of Reach preface, alongside Congressman Richie Torres and Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, vice chairs of the Renters Caucus. And at a critical time in history, for nationwide housing poverty and homelessness, Representative Gomez founded the first ever Renters Caucus to put the renters agenda on the table to address the national need for affordable and equitable housing. And we have the data to support these efforts. Since 1996, NLIHC's annual Out of Reach report has provided the data on America's housing disparities. And now in its 50th year of advocacy, NLIHC reinforces the commitment to achieving housing justice. And Out of Reach 2024 shows that while the US economy continues to rebound in the wake of the pandemic, the lowest income renters still confront significant challenges finding and maintaining access to safe and affordable rental housing. And the report continues to urge Congress to make substantial long-term investments in deeply targeted affordable housing programs like housing choice vouchers, the National Housing Trust Fund, and public housing to address the affordable housing and homelessness crisis, and to enact strong tenant protection policies to promote housing stability for the lowest income renters. And so to further discuss the long-term robust federal investments critically needed is NLIHC's President and CEO, Diane Yantel. We will then have an address from Congressman Gomez, followed by a data summary of the report by NLIHC's Manager of Research, Dan Emanuel. And so now we'll welcome Diane Yantel.
Great, thank you, Jen. And I'll add my thanks to all of you for joining us today to hear about and talk about the results of the release of NLIHC's Out of Reach report. So Out of Reach is an annual publication of the National Income Housing Coalition that highlights really the gulf between the wages that people earn and the price of decent rental housing in every state, metro area, and county in the United States. And this year, we're releasing Out of Reach report as renters with the lowest incomes are struggling mightily to keep roofs over their heads. More renters than ever before are paying more than they can afford on rent. Eviction filings have reached, or in many communities, surpassed pre-pandemic levels. Homelessness has increased to record levels. Housing costs are increasingly a top concern of most voters. And any day now, the Supreme Court will hand down its ruling on whether or not communities can ticket, fine, or jail unhoused people for sleeping outside, even when there is no safe alternative available to them. There's no doubt that the housing crisis has worsened post-pandemic. Between 2021 and 2022, median rent had increased by a full 25%. And at the same time, costs for necessities like food and transportation were also up, all of it leaving low-income renters with tighter than ever budgets and forcing them to make difficult trade-offs in their budget, sacrificing childcare, medical care, store-bought food in order to maintain their housing. More recently, those rent increases have stabilized and even declined slightly in some areas, but those rents remain considerably higher than they were before the pandemic. The median rent in January of this year is still 20% higher than it was in January 2021. And these increased rents are resulting in increased homelessness. The US Government Accountability Office has found that a $100 increase in median monthly rent is associated with a 9% increase in homelessness in that community. And rents in the last few years have risen by nearly $200 a month. And so, as expected, as a direct result of these rising rents, homelessness has increased in many communities throughout the country, reaching its highest level on record after the fastest increase on record last year. But even before these rent increases, renters with the lowest incomes faced the effects of a long-standing trend of rents rising faster than wages. Between 2001 and 2021, rents increased about 18%, while household income only increased by about 3%. Now, congressional inaction compounds the housing crisis. We've had decades of chronic underfunding for housing assistance, which results in what is essentially a housing lottery system in our country, where only the lucky 25% of eligible households receive the housing assistance they need. So addressing the housing crisis requires action. It requires long-term federal investments in affordable housing. As the pandemic proved, federal policies and resources can play a pivotal role in establishing a robust housing safety net and keeping tens of millions of people who otherwise would lose their homes stably housed. Federal investments in expanding proven solutions like housing choice vouchers, the National Housing Trust Fund, public housing, and emergency rental assistance are badly needed and long overdue. As a country, we have the data, the partnerships, the expertise, the solutions, and the means to end homelessness and housing instability in our country. We lack only the political will to fund those solutions at the scale necessary. But thankfully, we have partners in Congress who understand the need and are leading efforts to advance comprehensive solutions. And we're very glad to have one such leader with us here today, Congressman Jimmy Gomez, who also, as Jen mentioned, co-authored the preface of our report. Congressman Gomez represents the 34th District of California, and he is a leader of the Congressional Renters Caucus. Prior to his election to Congress in 2017, he served in the California State Assembly, and he championed issues to improve the lives of low-income people in his state. Today, he serves on the House Ways and Means Committee. He's a member of the House Democratic Leadership. He's a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and Hispanic Caucus. And he is the founder and leader of the Congressional Renters Caucus, which, as they put it, serves as a, quote, launching pad for legislative efforts and advocacy to finally give renters a voice in Washington. And we are very grateful for Congressman's leadership and for joining the briefing today. And I will turn it over to you, Congressman Gomez. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, Diane. I'm off the house floor, so it's a little noisy over here.
We appreciate you so much. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. And first, let me just thank all the work that you're doing regarding this report and making sure that we continue pushing the issues regarding rent and the rental crisis that we're facing and the housing crisis we're facing in this country forward. As the representative of downtown LA, I know this has been an issue in Los Angeles for years. And it was an issue that was getting bigger and bigger in California when I was in the state legislature, and we were struggling to address it. But this issue has now expanded from the urban areas to the rural areas to the big states like California and New York, to every state in the country. And this is an issue, I think, that as time has come for national action, because this is something that we're hearing from members from areas that you wouldn't expect. I was talking to a Republican member who said that I asked him, what's the number one issue you're facing? He is from Omaha, Nebraska. He said housing, affordable housing. A member from Orlando, Florida. I asked him, what's the number one issue you're going to work on once you get reelected? He said housing. So this is no longer a blue state, blue city issue. This is an American crisis that we need to tackle head on. And that means that we need to make sure that we build consensus, but we have uh, uh, policies and funding that rises to the level of the crisis, and that we're not there yet. Most of our efforts, I say, have been too small, too slow, and too inefficient. And that means that we need to do more. Now, the average American, people are reading, is rent burden, meaning that they pay more than 30% of their income towards rent. In some of the worst areas, they're paying 50% of their income towards rent. And when you add that plus childcare, the American family is paying anywhere from almost 60% of their income towards two things. So this is not just hurting families, it's also hurting our economy, because when people can't save to buy a house, when they can't save to start a business, when they can't save to pay down debt, that means that they're going to be worse off in the long term. So we need to get this started. So we started the Congressional Renters Caucus so that we can collaborate and coordinate across committee jurisdictions, because different committees have different jurisdictions. Housing vouchers, Section 8, go through financial services. That's why Richie Torres and Ayanna Presley are my vice chairs. The low income housing tax credit and tax credits to help renters are going to go through Ways and Means. So we have to see it through not only throughout the different districts, but the different committees that have jurisdictions. The Renters Caucus is trying to do one, increase supply to make sure that we have more supply of housing and more supply of affordable housing so that people can make sure that they can have places to live. Two, we want to remove the barriers to people getting housed. And three, we want to make sure that they're not getting taken advantage of, because a lot of renters are paying what we call a hidden rent burden through these user fees, everything from mail sorting, a fee to contact your landlord, you name it, they're getting charged a bunch of fees. So we're going to keep working on this issue to lower the cost, and increase the supply. Those have to be done. If not, we're going to be in this situation for years to come. A lot of our programs are good, but they need more resources. A good example in Build Back Better, we're going to have the most money going into the low income housing tax credit. It was going to help build 800,000 units over 10 years. Not nearly enough. We need to build about 1 million units per year for the next 10 years. So we got to think bigger, and we need to make sure that we build that public consensus. And unfortunately, the public consensus is getting built because of the crisis that is no longer isolated to certain states. It is nationwide. So this report is going to help kind of provide more of those details, and also give some solutions on how do we bend this curve. This is, and what I like to remind people, this isn't just about housing. This is about economic competitiveness. If our workers and American families are struggling, then they can't help our economy grow. They can't help their communities thrive, and that next generation cannot do better than the last. So with that, I want to just thank, of course, the National Low Income Housing Coalition for doing this report and keeping this issue on the forefront. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Representative Torres. Gomez, excuse me, so sorry. Thank you so much, Congressman Gomez. And thank you for all of your tremendous work, and especially with founding and establishing the Congressional Renters Caucus. You said it perfectly. We have more to do. So thank you. And with that, we'll start with the data. The data is our baseline. The data is the foundation for this work. The proof is here. And so to provide a data summary for the report, we'll now move over to NLIHC's Manager of Research, Dan Emanuel.
Hi, Jen. Thank you so much for that introduction. So as Jen said, I'm going to be going over the main findings from this year's Out of Reach report. Next slide, please. So really at its core, Out of Reach tries to answer the question, how much does a full-time worker need to earn to afford fair market rent? And the answer to that question is really encapsulated in a statistic we call the housing wage. So next slide. And in 2024, the national housing wage for a two-bedroom rental unit at fair market rent is $32.11, and it's $26.74 for a one-bedroom unit at fair market rent. Next slide. And in addition to national housing wages, we also calculate housing wages for every state, metro area, county, and combined non-metro area in the country for this report. And this map specifically shows the statewide housing wage for two-bedroom rental homes, which ranges from $18.38 in North Dakota to $47.38 in California. And unsurprisingly, housing wages are highest in traditionally high-cost states like California, Hawaii, Massachusetts, and New York. But it's also worth noting that two-bedroom housing wages exceed $18 in every state at this point. And while it's not shown in this map, housing wages also tend to be higher in metro areas, right? And in the top 6 metro areas with the highest two-bedroom housing wages are all in California. And among those, the highest housing wages in Santa Cruz, where it's $77.96. Next slide, please. And of course, a lower housing wage doesn't necessarily mean housing is affordable to renters, since areas with lower wages also tend to have lower housing wages also tend to have lower wages generally, right? And renters in these areas really do still struggle to afford housing. And in this map, it specifically shows the hours a minimum wage worker needs to work to afford a one-bedroom rental home at fair market rent, where the darker areas represent more hours needed and lighter areas represent fewer hours needed to work in a week. And I'll note this map actually accounts for prevailing state or county level minimum wages wherever they're higher than the federal minimum. And it turns out, not including Puerto Rico, a full-time minimum wage worker can only afford a modest one-bedroom rental in about 6% of US counties, or 204 counties. And while it's not shown in this map, it's also probably also worth noting there's nowhere that a minimum wage worker can afford a two-bedroom unit at the fair market rent. Next slide, please. And of course, housing isn't out of reach just for the lowest wage or minimum wage workers. As you can see in this chart, more than 60% of all wage earners nationally earn an hourly wage that's actually less than the two-bedroom housing wage, and more than half of wage earners earn an hourly wage that's less than the one-bedroom housing wage. Next slide. And there are also wage disparities by race and ethnicity that we need to account for. And when we do that, we see Black and Latino workers actually face larger gaps between their wage and the cost of rental housing than white workers do. And nationally, the median wage of a white worker is just 26 cents less than the housing wage for a one-bedroom apartment, shown here by the lower horizontal line, while the median wage of a Black worker actually falls a full $6.24 short of and the median wage of a Latino worker falls $6.42 short. Next slide. And we also see that wages across a wide range of the most common occupations fall short of the national one and two bedroom housing wages. And in this chart, you can see that 14 of the top 20 most common occupations pay wages that are actually lower than the one or two bedroom housing wage. So about 64 million people, or approximately 42% of the entire workforce, is employed in one of these 14 occupations. Next slide. And then, of course, in this year's report, we also included a special focus on homelessness. The annual point-in-time count conducted by HUD in 2023 found that approximately 653,000 people were experiencing homelessness on a given night last year, which is actually the highest number that's ever been recorded for that count. And it actually represents a 12% increase over the previous year. So we're really facing historic challenges when it comes to this issue. And unfortunately, some states and localities are responding to this by trying to criminalize homelessness instead of addressing its root cause, which is really a lack of affordable housing options. So for this year's report, we really thought it was important to highlight both the efficacy of the housing first model, and most importantly, really the need to expand housing assistance, because really any true solution to homelessness starts with housing. So next slide. And of course, speaking of housing assistance, given all the affordability challenges we've documented and our lack of an adequate housing safety net that Diane kind of laid out for you earlier, we call for a number of policy solutions in the report, including increased federal investments in the preservation of existing affordable housing so that we're not losing it to disrepair and subsidy expirations, and also investments in programs that expand the supply of new deeply affordable units. We also need an expansion of rental assistance provided by the Housing Choice Voucher Program, as well as the creation of a national housing stabilization fund to help stabilize renters who need temporary emergency rental assistance. And then finally, of course, we also need more robust renter protections to ensure the safety and just treatment of renters wherever they live.